Am I live now? We check. Yep, we are live.
Yep, we are live.
Just a second.
Yep.
Just a second. Okay. The chat fucking fine. Hello.
Chat.
Yep. It's well and good.
Chat. Yep.
So, hello everyone. Welcome back to the channel. First of all, Happy Republic Day. It's the 77th day of the Holy Law of the Land. I hope thus the aspirations of the preamble are still up and alive in our cells. And let's get back to the business of geopolitics. So, I think we had discussed somewhere around 71 questions from the document which I had been discussing about. Before heading up ahead, if you are new to the channel, disclaimer, I'm not a geopolitical expert. I'm just someone who loves to talk about geopolitics. And a friend of mine had compiled for me some 100 questions via the help of ChatGPT. And we have been discussing about the questions. So far, we have discussed a lot regarding India, China, diplomacy, the way things have been evolving about. And now we're left with some 30 odd questions. So without any further delay, let's get started. Just making sure the chat's working fine. The live stream is on, so if you want to ask any doubts or just we want to hear, do free feel to talk. So let's start. Does economic growth ensure geopolitical power? I think we had covered this earlier also, that can military lead to the foreign policy, or can, I think it was somewhere here where I mentioned. Just a second. Yeah, here. So I think we discussed here in a lot of detail where can military power be more important than economic power, or can it be the vice versa? And I think same goes with the idea of here. Despite the fact that you can have a huge amount of economy well functioning for you, I don't think economic growth per se can only lead towards geopolitical power, because at the end of the day, there are much more aspects when it comes to the idea of geopolitics. I had mentioned yesterday particular framework, the medics framework. So whenever you have to evaluate any particular country or the policies which have been happening about, you need to see in the light of military. Just a second. Make sure chart's working fine.
Make sure chat's working fine.
Yes. So these are the things which we need to take in account whenever we are discussing about geopolitical power. It's the military, economic, the development, the institutions, the culture, and strategy. So I think these all dimensions at the end of the day provide you a geopolitical power. For example, if I take the case of USA, first of all, why USA was stated to be the geopolitical power in the era of Cold War times. So, j- just 1 second. Sorry. So, in the case of the Cold War era, why USA was called the key, I would say, the geopolitical power. So, if I take the angle of first of all the medic, militarily at that time USA had shown its domination. It had dropped the Hiroshima and Nagasaki disaster which happened to place. The little boy and the fat man bomb, it was dropped in Japan. Then post that, their support to European nations in taking down Hitler and overall consolidating the power in the European nations. That showed how a military as an asset worked in favor for the USA. Same I can link also to the case of Russia. Russia was able to defeat Hitler. They were able to reach till the line of Berlin. So that's here I see the idea of military power helping Russia, sorry, USSR and USA as a geopolitical power. Let's come to the case of economy then. So why economy was seen as an angle in the case of geopolitics? So, like I mentioned last time, also USA had been providing the Marshall Aid and the other plans towards the side of European, basically this particular area of West Europe, where they were able to provide loans, they were to provide the geopolitical aids, which overall helped them to grow as an economy and to refurbish back from the disasters and the overall, I would say, deficiencies which took place during the time of the Cold War era. Same was the case of USSR. Despite the fact that yes, communism as a economic power failed at the end of the day when the 1991 fall happened, but still in the initial run-up, the way USSR had positioned itself and the way it was able to control countries like the Belarus, Ukraine, and other countries here, the economic power showcased how they were, as an industrial, I would say, giant, able to do the things which were in the favor. That was the case of economy. Once again, development, like I mentioned, the Marshall Aid plans, the infrastructure buildup which USA had been doing across the world, even in the case of Russia, we saw that even the longest train just here only, I think, maybe if not change, longest train route in the world. I think it's still the Russia which holds, yes, this Trans-Siberian Railway in Russia. So this shows that the idea of why infrastructure development matters a lot. Then the came of institutions. So USSR and USA are the key two poles at that time, and they were able to showcase and work with majority of institutions and power. That's the case for the case of institutions. In the case of culture, once again, the geopolitical angle, it was the fight between capitalism versus the communism, the biggest two ideologies which were at play, whether we are liberalizing our overall economy or we are, I would say, playing it safe. We are taking the things in the economy itself. That was the case for that. And then the came of strategy, the idea of nuclear powers. That's the reason why the two countries never went against war of each other, or the way they were able to position themselves with the rest of the world. That's the thing which I feel comes into importance when we ensure a geopolitical power. It's not just the economy thing which can help them, but it's the military, the development, the institutional base which they have, the culture they are able to showcase, and the way they are positioning the strategy across the world. So that's the part for ensuring geopolitical power. Is democracy a strategic asset? Let's build this angle in two words: the pros and the cons. Democracy is a strategic asset with the angle of pros. I think the key example would be the way, I would say, countries are then able to interact with each other. Countries interaction with each other. For example, I take the case of India itself. The reason why India is able to communicate with the rest of the world, or the way we are able to associate ourselves with even G7 and other institutions, the biggest reason is our democratic setups, the way we are able, as compared to say the case of Iran or Afghanistan. In the case of Afghanistan, we see as the current Taliban regime has been operating. A majority portion of the world is not actually dealing. The biggest reason being the fall of democracy, the way institutional setup has been established there, the rights have been curtailed. So that's the reason why a lot of the world does not wish to, I would say, associate with Taliban. Same is the case for Iran also. If I take you back to the case of the 1970s when the Shah of Iran was still there, USA and the European countries were in very much, I would say, communication with the Iranian governments. That's the reason why Iran was seen as a very good strategic asset for USA at the time. Or when the Shah of Iran was deposed, the Ayatollah Khomeini regime came about. USA did not saw Iran as a strategic asset. Rather, it was seen as a, I would say, revisionist agency, a threat to the overall US, I would say, superiority. So that's where I feel democracy as a strategic asset matters a lot. The more and more, I would say, democratic setup, the setup you have, the more and more democratic institutions you follow, your overall interaction with the rest of the world starts to improve. Whereas if you follow the path of a non-democracy, somewhat different approach, you're not able to talk with the rest of the world. Just a second. Arun bhai, welcome to the chat. Nice to have you. So that's the case for democracy as a strategic asset, and I think it matters a lot. That's the idea of the pros here. For the case of cons, I think I had mentioned it last yesterday only that in the era of today's multipolar world, when we are interacting with a lot of countries, multilateralism has even started to impact the way we are able to deal with each other. For example, the way we are in institutional setups, or the way, I would say, alliances have been building up. The more and more connectivities we are having amongst each other, it also somewhere leads to some issues. For example, the case of how should I explain it without sounding any controversial? I think China could be a good example, which I can link here. So, like I had mentioned earlier, also the way China was able to rise up post the issues which they initially faced, the China's ability to, I would say, counteract against the way things used to happen inside their policy, though the way which they had done was absolutely wrong. For example, the 1979 issues and the other 1980s issue. But if we see from a, I would say, bigger picture, the way they were able to position the country and the way the development and the other activities was envisaged, I think China did well there. And if I have to quote a good example, I think it would be the fight of climate change in China. So you all must remember that photos of Beijing pollution control. So there was this yellow photo, I think they can show. Yeah, yeah, here. So this is how Beijing at one time used to look like. The pollution had been increasing up day and day in the case of China, and to counteract against the pollution, a formal setup had been positioned in the administration of China. The bureaucracy was tied to the way they are able to deal with the pollution. They were tied, their promotion, their overall pay scale was tied whether the changes are taking place in the pollution or not. And based upon that, we saw how China has changed. This is how it used to look like past 2008 and 9, I would say. And then post 2015, 2016, this is how it looks like right now. Though this shows that how when the complete power of democracy, I would say, does not exist, the policies, I would say, are get implemented. But once again, it's, I would say, a black and shady area. Yes, China has been able to do things which many democratic setups cannot do, but the thing is, people's rights, liberty, and the way they want to position their stance, that's something which starts to miss about. So that's where I feel that yes, though democracy has been a strategic asset for a majority of countries, there are countries which have, I would say, gone for an unconventional path and have done things the way they have done. But yes, once again, there's difference between the idea of growth versus development. Though they have achieved a lot of growth in the way their economy or the way their setup of country has been, however, the overall development in that country has been, I would say, at a meager end. So that's the case for democracy as a strategic asset. Is inequality a geopolitical issue? Is inequality a geopolitical issue? Is this a philosophical question which I have to ask? Is inequality a geopolitical issue? I don't get the example for why the context has been there. Is it because the countries which have inequality facing geopolitical issues? If I think this is the way the question has been positioned up, so I can answer this in the form that the case of Iran, first of all, like Iran has had faced inequalities within the country. People are not free, especially the women, and we have seen how it has culminated in the recent protests. I think if this is what the question is trying to ask me, so this would be the answer which this would be the way answer should come about. For example, if I take the case of Iran once again, the amount of inequalities which had been rising within Iran and the way things had been happening up, people are once again standing and taking a stance for themselves. And as they are taking a stance for themselves, the world is seeing it. USA has been watching it, and people are loving it. So that's where I would say the geopolitical angle comes about. Another angle, I think, of inequality, if I have to link, we can go towards Africa. Africa has been. Gitax is here. Thank you, bye. So if I take the link of, I would say, Africa, see the inequality, how it has become the issue of geopolitics. In the DRC, especially in the Congo area, you would be surprised to know a majority of the portion of the cobalt mines which are there in DRC, they have been taken over by China. And the thing is, it's a tribal setup. There are a lot many, I would say, gangs operating within the Congo area, and your so-called EV, which you feel is green, the way that EV and the methods of extraction of lithium, the cobalt, which takes place, the procedure is not at all green. Just a second. EV production, not at all green. And there has been reports wherein Congo and other mining locations, kids are being used for the same thing. Kids are being used for extraction process. So that's where I feel the idea of inequality gets linked with geopolitical issues. I think one thing more I can quote here: the Rotterdam Conventions and the Bamako Conventions. So there was a precedent. Very sorry for my accent sometimes. There was a precedent in the earlier times wherein the European countries and the Western allies, they used to dump their waste in Africa. Like they would take their ship, they would take their, I would say, overall waste material, and they would dump at the coastlines of Africa, or they would pay even the African countries that you can have our waste, so that we are free from that issues. And then the world started to see that the way inequality and the want of money, I would say, on the side of African countries for their own growth, they were being pressurized by the Western powers that you can take the money and you can have our waste. That's where the idea of Bamako Convention came about. It's an interesting fact. Just So yeah, here was the Bamako Convention. It was signed for the African nations, wherein the import of the hazardous waste was being banned about. So that's where I feel the linkages between the geopolitics and the inequality would come about. And if I'm wrong, I think someone or the other would comment for the same. So that's my stance for the idea of inequality and geopolitical issues. Coming up next, how does climate change affect power? How does climate change affect power? Okay. Let's take the example of countries here. Suppose Russia, India, Pakistan, USA, and the island nations. I think this can cover very well the case for climate change then. So, first of all, the case of Russia. Island nation, ठीक है. For the case of Russia, see, the thing is, I had mentioned this in the last time also, but let me go a bit detail once again. This is the Arctic Sea. Arctic Sea as a majority of a portion of the area in the form of ice caps. And as the climate change has been, I would say, ramping up, the ice has been melting up, especially in the area of Arctic. I had covered this in the previous video also, the Arctic amplification. As and when the climate change effect has been expanding, the impact in the Arctic area has been more, and the ice has been melting a lot in the Arctic oceans. When the Arctic ice has been starting to melt about, the path which earlier Russia could not access, they have now started to access that. So climate change has favored Russia in the form of Arctic sea opening. They have a lot of crushers and, I would say, ships to cut through that ice, and by that they can now, I would say, harvest and channelize the natural resources located in the Arctic. And that's something which has been in the favor of Russia. That's the reason why when the idea of climate change comes about, they don't like to talk much about that. And if climate change would surely, as it would pick up its pace, Russia would be the biggest winner here because it can expand its Arctic projects. I'm not remembering the exact terms. There were some Arctic projects by Russia where China has been actively working about. Uh, there's no this name of Arctic project by Russia. I don't think I can remember that specific name. Yeah, here is it here. So these are some of the products which Russia has been doing, especially the Northern Sea route. So Northern Sea route has been something which has been a lot in the news. We show you a map here for reference also. So yeah, here. See, chat visible, yes. So this is how initially the route would look like. Whenever the trade would go, it would go somewhere around this particular route. However, if the Arctic ice is opened up and the Bering Strait can be also utilized, Northern Sea route overall helps Russia in the trade. So that's where I feel Russia would be a biggest winner when the geopolitics, sorry, when the climate change would start to increase more and more. Coming up next to the case of India. See, in the case of India, I think there would be two angles here: the desert angle, the, I would say, Himalayas, and the water issue. I think this something that would take a long, I would say, cycle, but we have started to see that the climate change has impacted the ice caps in India a lot. If yeah, even take the example of this particular year, I don't remember the exact data, but it was somewhere quoted that this particular year has been the driest, I would say, winter spell in so many long times. The recent spell which had happened last week only in the area of Jammu Kashmir and Uttarakhand, that was the first time when a proper snowfall has started to come about in the areas of Himalaya and the mountains. And as and when the delays start to happen with respect to snow following and the lack of replenishing of the ice caps on the glaciers, it will impact the downstream activities of agriculture and other aspects also. And with India sharing, I would say, the resources with Pakistan, that's something I feel adds up to the issue of the rivers and the climate change. So that's the case I would feel for the border issue. It's a very complex question. I don't know why it's added it, but okay. So that's the thing which I feel for the border issue. In the long run, as and when the climate change would start on increasing and increasing, the way India has been able to position itself, the agriculture advantage which we have been having happening about in the plain area, that could get impacted a lot if the case of climate change keeps on expanding. Desertification is something which has been in the news a lot, especially in the case of Sahara also. As and when the desertification has been happening about, the fertile land which we used to have has been decreasing. So that's something which can impact the overall power. So that's the case for that. Pakistan has been facing the brunt of climate change a lot. There was that recent also news of locust attacks happening and the flash flood cases. So these are small things which impacts the overall country, which has been unstable and its own, and also that's the case for that. USA, when it comes to climate change, currently Mr. Trump is in power, and Mr. Trump feels climate change is a joke. So he has been pulling out of the agencies surrounding climate change. And that's where I feel climate change definition and the way things had been happening, about the way discussion was happening, that has started to change. I had mentioned in the last video also the difference between the developed countries and the developing countries seeing climate change. And that's where the main issues come about. The island nations have started to see their impact. Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, had to be changed. There are many other island small nations in the Pacific Ocean which have been uh, asking for pleas and asking for, I would say, some of the other measures wherein the climate change can be stopped and the loss and damage fund can be established for helping them. So that's something which will remain in the news for long times to come by. So this is for the case of climate change. Coming up next is national security more important than liberty? I think the angle of democracy within the ambit of geopolitics, and the idea of chauvinism and nationalism, which I already covered. Chauvinism and nationalism, it has already been covered here. How should states fight terrorism ethically? Hmm. I don't know why this particular word has been mentioned specifically ethically. Is it being mentioned in the context that when we are, I would say, attacking the terrorist organizations, we should, I would say, have a just, yeah, I think it's thing which has been mentioned. Okay, so there's a theory named the just power and the just war theory in international relations, and I think that's what being quoted here. So we saw in the case of Gaza issue, wherein Hamas had attacked Israel, and the counter attacks which took place, many kids and civilian suffered during that attacks. So that's where the idea of, I would say, ethics in the case of fighting against terrorism comes about. Because yes, like I mentioned in the previous video also, what Hamas did against Israel on 7th October 2023, that's not at all justified in any angle. But the way the response took place on the side of Israel, the way the bombings took place of the Gaza city, the way the entire city was decimated, I think that particular thing could have been avoided to some extent. The way kids were dying, the way the pictures were started to came about, I think it could have been avoided. And here's where I feel India worked efficiently and effectively well in the fight against terrorism. So, in the case of Operation Sindoor, as has been mentioned so many times, we did not attack any civilian base. We specifically targeted the terrorist organizations, the camps which they had, and the bases from which they were operating. We had a foolproof mechanism wherein we ensured that no civilian, I would say, casualty would take place. And that's where I feel the idea of fighting terrorism ethically comes about. So I think this is the context which was being asked here. That yes, somewhat just war theory in international relations need to be applied, wherein your reaction towards a particular thing has to be justified to the same extent in which the issue exists. That's the case for terrorism fighting. Is cyber warfare changing conflict? Well, I'm not much of a tech guy, but if I have to give the context, so yes, it has been changing a lot, especially the drones and the linkage with tech. The Starlink project by Mr. Musk and the incidents wherein the digital and the tech, also the overall, I would say, power grid has been impacted in countries. So first of all, the Starlink project idea. So in the recent Iranian revolution, which was taking place, the Starlink, which has been operating in the Iranian zone, many people were able to benefit from that Starlink operation. They were able to provide information and context to the rest of the world, wherein the initial internet bases in the Iranian countries had been, I would say, stopped about. So they were able to use the Starlink, they were able to capitalize on Starlink, and the information sharing to outside world took place. And people in even the USA case, they got aware. They got aware of the actual on-ground issues. Even in the case of drones, we saw in the case of Ukraine how Ukrainians remodified the DIY drones, used basic tech, and were able to fight against even the tanks of Russia, against the Russian tanks. In the case of the grid power, I think even in the case of Venezuela, which happened recently, USA would have surely silenced their power grid first of all, and post that further attacks took place. Post that the infiltration took place. Even that case of Iran's nuclear, I would say, project. Long back, there was a virus, particular, I think, which had been installed in the Iranian nuclear bases. I don't remember the exact case. There was that Iran nuclear program damaged by spyware. There was some spyware which was in the news. Spyware. Stuxnet targets. This one. So that's where I feel the use of overall nuclear power, the cyber warfare has been increasing, and the way the conventional war used to take place, it's changing slowly and slowly. That's the case for cyber warfare, changing the conflict. Coming up, should space be militarized? I think the simple answer for this, that no, space should not be militarized, because I think the world is already in a bit of a pickle when it comes to the idea of wars and the way the power and tech has been evolving up. We saw in the case of Russia, Ukraine, the drones usage, even in the case of Operation Sindoor, amount of drones which were used. So if now we start to militarize the space, especially say if we position a nuclear weapon maybe in the space, that's gonna cause a huge issue, especially when already we see the number of satellites increasing in space. There is that Kessler syndrome, which we often talk about. Under the Kessler syndrome, the idea is basically that if some mishap happens wherein one particular satellite collides with other satellite, it could lead to a chain of events which could entirely decimate the way satellites have been positioned in the space. So with this particular thing in mind, the issue of, I would say, war and proliferation, I think space is something which should be left aside for the overall future of the world. That's the case for that. Should space be militarized? Coming up next ahead, are non-state actors overtaking states? Pakistan is a great example for this case. I think I could need more of a context for this thing. Are non-state actors overtaking states? I would need to do a bit of a more research here, because it's a nice topic which I feel can cover in a separate video. We saw the case of Syria, the case of Middle East. In fact, I would say the entire Middle East, the Houthis, the Hezbollah, the Assad regime, and the Kurdish, I would say, rebellion also. So it's gonna be a separate video for my side for this thing, because I would need for more context. Things have been also bringing up in the Caribbean and the Latin America for this thing. drug lords, drug mafias. So yeah, it's gonna be a separate video for this. Is nuclear deterrence ethical? I think we have covered up well in detail about nuclear deterrence already. How should democracy deal with autocracies? Hmm. How should democracy deal with autocracies? Hmm. I don't know why this question has been given. Is it in the context of Cold War time when USA used to favor regimes from the side which agreed to this stance, the case of the coups, which we have already discussed, or is the idea of the way we have been dealing with Iran or other regimes? So I think more or less, once again, this has been taken care of now. Idea is very simple when it comes to the idea of autocracies, and if they are, I would say, going against the idea of liberty of the people, they are being, I would say, a menace to the overall international peace and security. Possible change and means in which the international order takes place. I think those particular things have to be considered here. Can ethics and interests coexist? I have already covered this in long detail. The realism and Machiavelli. I mentioned so many times Machiavelli yesterday. Coming up next ahead. Is surveillance justified? I think there are two angles once again for this particular idea of surveillance being justified. So let's see it in the form of strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats. This is a SWOT analysis. It's one of the framework which can be applied when talking about any questions around geopolitics or in general any particular domain. This can be applied. So why I would say surveillance is justified by some particular, I would say, factions, and why its use. Ability to control the public order and idea of sedition, plus the crime and security check idea. But once again, the issue, the idea of sedition, the idea of public order, it's a very undefined and very loose term. For you, a particular thing which you have been, I would say, protesting, or I think you should have been claiming about, it could be seen as a completely different limelight by a particular faction or particular, I would say, part of the government. So that's where the issues of surveillance being justified comes about. That's where the weakness comes about. Loose definitions of what amounts to a wrong thing, a wrong slash right, plus the biggest idea, the privacy issue. Your privacy gets compromised. A camera is up and doing against you all the time. You know you are being watched and your actions are being controlled. So your actions are being, I would say, watched. So that's where I feel the idea of privacy and idea of liberty goes for a toss. What can be the opportunity? Why state governments, or I would say in general, the politicians across the world prefer the idea of surveillance is controlling dissent, capturing, or I would say focusing on high impact individuals, and once again the idea of security. Once again the idea of security, and once again coming back to the threats, you can be in, I would say, issue for any slash other thing which you say, because if you're under the surveillance of, I would say, an administration, and somewhere or the other you go for a slip up, I think your entire, I would say, reputation or even your own identity goes for a toss for there. That's a feel the case for surveillance being justified or not. How does misinformation affect geopolitics? I think we covered this in a long detail last time also. The case where Pakistan had been falsely claiming during the Operation Sindoor, and also in general the way things had been happening about claims which are being made by many media agencies. It, I would say, impacts the credibility, and also the main agenda gets sidelined. That's the case for how does misinformation affect geopolitics. Moving up next, that is what are the next conflict trigger, and are the resource was inevitable? I think these two particular questions have come together. It's, you can talk about them together. So yes, this is something which has been up and build up. There have been countries which have been facing the brunt of climate change and the way extraction has been happening about, especially in the case of resources. We saw the case of Congo, like I mentioned, in Africa. If I take you to Latin America, the concentration of lithium here. Yesterday we had talked about Taiwan, the semiconductor issue here. So resource wars are thing which become inevitable. There's the opening up of Arctic, like I mentioned in the start of the video, the issue of Greenland controlling the rights of the oil and the mining reserves here, and even across the, I would say, the ocean, the case of extraction of polymetallic nodules and the extraction amongst the abyssal plains. That's where I feel the idea of resource war becomes inevitable, because there is that central economic problem wherein you have scarcity of resources. So what to make and why to make and for whom to make, you have to justify that. Just a second. This particular question actually was told to me by my friend, so I just wanted to thank them. Just a second. Using your So yeah, that's the case where I feel that resource war becomes inevitable, because there is scarcity of resources. The overall minerals and overall reserve which we have are very limited, and if now the case which has been building up for the resources being scarce and scarce, the source war becomes inevitable. And coming the case of water, that's something which I feel has is going to happen very soon. If I show you a particular diagram, where and where is the world's water distribution. So I think there would be very nice image here. Yeah, here it is. This is how the Earth's water look like, despite the fact that a majority of the proportion of the entire Earth, 70%, holds water, but the fresh water that we have actually is just 2.5%. And even with that 2.5%, 68.7% is stored in the glaciers. Then this comes the groundwater. And the groundwater depletion has been something which has been in the news lately a lot. If I even take the case of India, Bangalore was facing this particular issue. There were many other uh, regions in India which are facing this particular issue. In the case of Delhi also, the concentration of uranium and other, I would say, harmful material has been rising lately. So that's where I feel the idea of water becoming an inevitable trigger point for war is going to happen. Even in the case of India and Pakistan, the Indus Water Treaty, I think sooner or later, if situation gets complex, if Pakistan is foolish enough to, I would say, attack India and the dams which they were saying that they would attack, it would trigger a great war. Even in the case of India-China, the build-up of dams across China's borders, that's something which adds to the triggers of issues. That's where I feel that yes, water can be the next conflict of trigger, and yes, the resource war are inevitable. Coming up next ahead, can international law restrain great powers? I think we did discuss this in a lot detail last time also, that the way rules-based order has been happening about, that rules-based order has just been scrapped away. People are doing things the way they want to do, and until and unless a common consensus amongst each other is not reached, this is something which has gone for toss now for now. Is security perception based? Yes, we had covered this last time a lot. Perception influencing geopolitics. How leaders decide under uncertainty. How should leaders decide under uncertainty? I think we covered this in detail also. Once again, that idea of medics, that if you're uncertain of how things are being built up, you need to, I would say, bring up a hedge. In the case of military, you should need to focus on first of all the short development and then for the long term goals. In the case of economy, you need to ensure institutional setup within your economy so that the fluctuation in the market is not there. Then comes either development institutions. That's where I feel the uncertainty angle comes about. I think if the specific context for that, I would like to read more on this. So that's the initial basic for the idea of leaders dealing in uncertainty. I think we had covered this last time on how suppose you are the president of China and then how you will build up an economy and how you will build the country for the future. Done. That's the case for this. How do nations manage stakeholders? Discussed in log detail the medics idea. Okay. Sorry. Medics idea. If geopolitics were a business, what is the strategy? If geopolitics were a business with a strategy, I think Mr. Trump would be the best candidate when the idea of when the idea of business comes about. So this is how I feel. Once again, the idea of medics, I can discuss it in brief detail. So if geopolitics was a business with a strategy, in the case of military, pump money in the defense sector, go for indigenous products and export defense. That's something which I feel would be the case for military angle and the business angle. In the case of economy, position your currency and increase institutional investment confidence to attract FDI and ensure growth. Once again, the case of development, go in for joint ventures, go in for collaborations, and ensure your infra is the best. In the case of institutions, I think here the Board of Peace Plan example would be the perfect one. Collab and use the monetary angle to ramp up cooperation and power. In the case of culture, like I said in the initial run up also, start to maybe monetize it. For example, China can use their Chinese products, Chinese food. Thailand case I had mentioned the last time, the gastronomy idea which they did. So that's where I feel the business angle comes about. And when it comes to the idea of strategy, follow alliances and treaties which lead to cash flow and economic returns. That's the case for if geopolitics were a business, what is the strategy? How would you explain geopolitics to a boardroom? I think the above question very much sums up the same thing here. If geopolitics was a business. Okay, 21st I've covered. 22 I've covered up. What leadership trait matters in foreign policy? What leadership traits matter in foreign policy? I think the idea of being firm, positioning, and providing yourself as the ideal location of nation is the best thing which any country can do. Which any country can do. Just 1 second. Sorry for the disturbance. Sajan bhai, thank you. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, it's fine now. So yeah, coming up ahead. What leadership traits matter in the foreign policy? I think being firm, being positioning, and providing yourself as an ideal location of a nation is the best thing which any country, I would say, leader can do. But being firm does not always work well. For example, the case of Mr. Trump, which has been happening recently, people have started to call out his aggressive path, and many are not loving the way he has been operating. So being rational also matters a lot, because if you are seen as an uncertain player, and if you're seen as someone who holds grudges and who works on the idea of egoism and individualism, it overall impacts the way foreign policy and long-term relations are fixed or where they are operated. So that's the thing which I feel being rational yet being firm is the case. Can countries be compared to firms? I think it can be compared, because end of the day, we just like firms have stakeholders, countries have their own stakeholders. For the case of firms, the stakeholders could be the CXO, the CFO, the board, the employees, and the employers. And in the case of countries, the stakeholders could be the president, the PM, the Lok Sabha, the Rajya Sabha, the people which we have, the alliances which we have, the partners we have. And that's where I feel the parallel can be drawn between a country and a firm. And once again, yeah, I think this is a business angle which I started to now build up out. And the reason why I think this question was included here was we have seen how things have been evolving recently. The geopolitics has been shaped not by, I would say, hardcore way the things used to happen, but the way of, I would say, money and the economy. And that's why such questions now are coming about. What can managers learn from geopolitics? You can watch and know the things which has been happening about, so that you can take better decisions. One of the biggest thing which now the world has been facing is the idea of uncertainty. So seeing the way uncertainty evolves and reading how, I would say, geopolitics have shaped nations, the lessons from the great leaders, I think that's something which some managers can focus on. How should leaders balance short versus long term? I think we've covered a well above here only itself when I mentioned the same thing. How should leaders balance short term versus long term? Is risk taking essential for leadership? Yep, very much. We saw the case of the way European countries now are finally, I would say, speaking up against the tactics by Mr. Trump and the bully tactics. So yeah, sooner or later you have to take a risk, because if you keep on nodding yes and yes, you are not going to get anything uh, at the end of the day. If we take the example of Shabazz Sharif, our dear friend, our dear neighborhood friend Pakistan, the way Pakistan has positioned itself and the way their leader has been positioning themselves during the, I would say, alliances and the international meets, this shows that if you are a leader who represent himself to be weak and who directly bows to the command of the main hegemony power, your reputation goes for a toss. We could very much see the way people were reacting when President, sorry, Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif was, I would say, praising Mr. Trump. So that's the angle where I feel the risk-taking capacity should be there. Because if you are not risk averse, if you're not able to take those risks, A, you lose reputation, and B, you become a scapegoat for the things to happen. That's the case for risk-taking capacity. How do you choose when all options are costly? I think SWOT analysis, seeing what works, what does not work, managing the pros and the cons very well, seeing the things which has been happening about. I think that's where I feel evaluation of costly can happen. You can take a stock of your current, I would say, economic base, the way things have been evolving about. That's the case for choosing optionals which are costly. What does responsible power mean today? Responsible power. Responsible power. I think it's again linking that angle. So, a responsible power today is, which is militarily, I would say, sufficient, yet not aggressive. See, here the idea of just what theory, like I mentioned, comes about. You can have the entire power at your hand, but if you are someone of a bully, if you are using your power just for your own sake, that's not how a responsible power builds about. Uh, as and more you go in a confrontational state with another country or with another region, the issues add up, and I would say the reputation of you being responsible or the way your image gets presented to the rest of the world, that gets impacted a lot. So that's where the idea of responsible power and being militarily sufficient yet not aggressive comes about. In the case of economy, I would say positioning an investor friendly lookout, engaging in developmental aids and other policy. I think this is something which can help to show that you are, I would say, a responsible power who does not see economy as hard cash or hard gains. Rather, you are someone willing to cooperate and invest amongst each other. Then comes the idea of development. I would say going well and beyond and helping others also. Here's where I feel the idea of India's neighborhood policy, the way India has positioned itself, the way we are always ready to help and contribute the best we can in the fame in the name of the development aids which we provide, and the cooperative value chains we build. Like for example, the case of Bangladesh, we had an association with Bangladesh in the form of electricity sharing. Even in the case of Nepal and Bhutan, that shows how you are a responsible power and yet a strong at your own end. Coming up to institutions, once again respecting the setup and engaging with others. And India, I feel, has been doing a very great job when it comes to the IDM institutions. We were inclusive to position the expansion of G20 when we when the G20 sorry when the African Union came about in G20. That shows how you are responsible power and why people would want to interact with you. Culture, using soft power, and I would say the diaspora channels goes on to show that you are not just looking from a quant stat, but also from the qualitative angle. I think the questions which for today were less of, I would say, geopolitics and more of, I would say, ethical based or business oriented one. So not much context coming up here. And once again, the idea of strategy. I think being open on your stance of, say, no first use policy in nuclear, and also the idea of military, I would say, build up or confrontational tone. That's something I feel which shows that you are a responsible power and you don't see things as us versus B. So yeah, I think today's discussion more or less was less on strategy, sorry, less on context and more around ethical and I would say moral questions which we can discuss or which we would should know about. So yeah, finally done with those 100 questions. It's been a great, I would say, turn of events that I was able to do this live stream. I think it took me 3 live streams to cover the entire 100 questions, but yeah, we have covered that finally. So once again, thanks a lot if you were part of the stream. I really appreciate that. I hope I did not said anything or any other particular statement which was politically incorrect or I would say had hurt sentiments of someone. So apologies for that. Anyways, thanks a lot for tuning in. I think sooner or later more topics which I can find for geopolitics some interesting, I would say, case studies which we can discuss. I would share the same very soon, maybe on live stream or on a normal video. If you have any doubts or any suggestions which you want to offer, you can reach out to me on my Instagram and LinkedIn IDs also. It's been attached in my YouTube channel itself. And apart from that, the comment section is always open up. So, anyways, thanks a lot. See you soon once again. Yeah, thank you.